So, I just finished watching the latest documentary by Kickstarter crap and degenerate content producer turned filmmaker Idubbbz, and I have to say, this feels like his best yet. Running at over an hour, Getting Away With It is his longest documentary to date, and I think it stands out clearly against Ice Cream Man or Full Force as a documentary that goes beyond attempting to tell the current story of an obscure content creator. If anything, I think that this documentary, while being mostly a rare instance of Idubbbz getting punked, is the deepest dive into someone that the YouTuber has made so far. Even while being effectively in a week-long Sam Hyde skit, Idubbbz sought to unearth the man behind the memes, and yet again, the former gets away with it. Or does he? Because I think that even with the few 100% Sammy serious moments that we got, we can start to look at the question of who Sam Hyde really is. If you don't know Sam Hyde and you haven't watched his or Idubbbz's recent documentaries, well, I don't believe you. Why would you be watching this loser, aka me, instead of some actually talented and creative people? Anyway, Sam Hyde is a guy that if you don't know fully, you've seen a meme of him somewhere on the internet, either being blamed for a shooting or making a horrendous face that's used for memes for months. Sam Hyde is one of those fellas that can make an impact even with a smaller audience, just by being who he is. He mostly makes comedy videos which are pushing the boundaries between meta-irony and just plain racism and sexism. And when I say pushing the boundaries, I mean really pushing what can be considered a joke. Even to this day, Sam continues to spout slurs, make offensive comments, and do everything he can to just rile people up. He's made his audience on being able to offend practically anyone, and not in a Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson type way, where they're trying to actually beat you with fact and logic. Sam just wants to make himself laugh, it seems, and he seems to be happy if other people are laughing along the way. You'll notice I've used the word seems, and talk about Sam lying on the fence between just being racist and being comedic. Well, that's because Mr. Hyde is a bit of an internet enigma. If you try and think about the things people actually know about Sam, then you end up drawing up a lot of blanks. Despite being a personality on the internet, one who shows his face and what appears to be his political gender on a regular basis, we know a surprisingly little amount about the guy behind the screen, the man behind the slaughter, if you will. It's a bit like kayfabe in pro wrestling, an older tradition that had a wrestler constantly remain in character so that they appeared as the hero or villain at all times. Wrestlers rarely remain in character now, and the same can be said for most celebrities and internet influencers. Take Filthy Frank, for example, and you see someone that was always a character, rarely seen on screen without one of his odd and wacky personas. Yet, over time that became too much for the man known as Joji, and he was better off just being himself to the world. What happens though, when the character and the person are blended so perfectly well that to tell the difference between the two is nearly impossible? What do you get when the layers of meta-irony are lathered so thick that anything coming out of someone's mouth could be a joke or Sammy serious? Well, you get Sam Hyde. Idubbbz's documentaries so far, looking at Full Force and Ice Cream Man, have really been more about finding these once popular, now obscure creators and showing their lives as they are. It's not Idubbbz's fault that the two focuses for the prior documentaries have fallen on what most would consider hard times. However, it doesn't take a genius to guess that Idubbbz likely thought he'd discover a similar fate to have fallen on $1 Million Extreme's Sam Hyde. Whether the man behind an enormous amount of shootings is having a rough period or not is unknown, because instead of giving Idubbbz an honest portrayal, Hyde decided to punk the YouTuber, giving him exactly what he expected to find in an absurdist comedy format. Honestly, the work done by both creators in creating the documentary and the parody is worth a watch, and I think both Idubbbz and Hyde do a brilliant job entertaining throughout. However, as we come to the end of Idubbbz's documentary, he reflects on his time with Sam, showing his disappointment at the lack of truth we found within him. While he says Sam wasn't very cooperative, I don't necessarily think that this is all Sam's fault, as, in my mind, the comic has become the character of Sam Hyde over his years of portraying him, leaning deeper into the meta-irony and further away from any sort of sincerity. Effectively, and I know this is a bit of a stretch, but I'm not sure how much of the real Sam Hyde exists anymore. And if it does, it's definitely not on display to strangers. As Idubbbz points out in his documentary, Sam Hyde's comedy operates on a level of irony beyond what many consider to be irony. This makes it very hard to tell when Sam is joking and when he's not. However, this does not only make it tricky for the audience to understand what's a joke and what isn't, it also makes the person telling the joke begin to question what is the joke and what isn't. My point being that when you've been in the game as long as someone like Sam Hyde, building more and more on this character who is an absurd and yet hyper-realistic version of a person, you begin to forget where the line is between the character and the person behind it. There's rarely a shut-off point for people on the internet, and so for Hyde this likely meant pretty much remaining in character all the time. I think this problem isn't just restricted to Hyde though, and I think if anything it becomes a form of derealization, something that is talked about in another comedy show. Bo Burnham's Inside is quite the different form of comedy compared to Sam Hyde's jokes, yet when I was watching Getting Away with It, I found a strange connection between the way Bo Burnham struggles with his relationship with comedy creation and himself, and the way Sam Hyde does. It's clear that in his mind Burnham has a vision of himself or his character, and yet the real Bo Burnham behind that cannot always live up to the character, causing severe mental strife. Burnham in Inside comes across as honest and open, yet you can never be sure if what you're watching is the genuine Burnham or all part of the act. The same can be said for Hyde, who is often shielded by irony and comedy, at least where his political agenda is concerned. Beyond politics though, which most people who watch Sam have seen through, the person who is Sam Hyde remains unknown. Despite Idubbbz' disappointment, it was unlikely that he was ever going to get anything real from Sam Hyde, as not only was Hyde initially on the defensive, but he's not an open book. The question now is, why is Sam so closed off? I think the easiest way to look at that answer, and the reason I thought about the strange man that is Sam Hyde, is largely due to watching the documentary that he put out 4 weeks before Idubbbz released his. Now, unlike most people, I didn't see the Hyde documentary first, and so I wasn't in on the joke at first, though I did know Ian was getting punked quite early in. This meant that watching the Hyde documentary for me became more of a director's commentary or behind the scenes of the initial Idubbbz documentary, and I'm sure any person watching the videos in that order would think the same. For me, it wasn't Idubbbz' analysis of Sam Hyde that made me believe he was truly becoming a character or had blended the lines between reality and fiction. Instead, watching as Sam and his cronies talk about what they had in their plans and noticing the footage from their side, I saw a bit more of the man behind the gag, which made me realise just how deep into the character of Sam Hyde he was. Take the first 10 minutes or so of Sam's video for example, as he takes us through the ideas that him and his pals have for messing with Idubbbz. A lot of these ideas fall under the absurdist, ironic comedy that Sam is known for, like just a random bag of dead wasps. Now, I found myself laughing at most of these jokes for messing with Idubbbz, even though very few of them actually end up making it into the footage. However, something else I noticed was how many of these ideas revolve around Sam, and when he's reading out the concepts, Sam even refers to himself in the third person, as though he's not talking about himself, but a character that he's portraying. This means then that not only is Sam Hyde in character for the majority of Idubbbz' documentary, but that this character of Sam Hyde revolves largely around the belief that you're watching a real person. This is the key, I think, to how Hyde has blurred the lines between the character he portrays and himself. Over the years, his actions and skits have become more and more bizarre, leading you to believe that the character of Sam Hyde can do pretty much anything and it be believable, like hang on to a teddy bear or blankie and be extremely defensive of it, or just carry around a couple of jaw exercise things, or even have a crackhead for a girlfriend. It's both extremely interesting and baffling how Hyde keeps getting away with punking people even like Idubbbz, who you'd have expected to see this coming a mile off. Sam Hyde, though, makes you believe that whatever he does as a person, his character can conceivably do, and vice versa. Whether that's insanity or genius is up to you, but it is due to the fact that he's blurred the line between character and person so well that he can keep getting away with anything. Perhaps Sam Hyde shields his true self away because he fears it to be boring compared to the character. Perhaps he's always 100% Sammy serious and should actually be hunted for his crimes. Or perhaps, as I think, he's not really sure himself what the line is between the character of Sam Hyde and the very real person behind it. I don't think we'll ever get to know the real Sam Hyde, and though Idubbbz made a valiant effort, he didn't even come close. Thank you for watching. Peace, love, subscribe and all that. Also, I do think Hyde's pretty racist, which mostly stops me from enjoying his comedy. Yeah, just clearing that up. Love ya. Bye.